Okay, I've had a couple of people ask how the car is doing. It's been about 10,000 miles, and I've also had a couple of people ask about whether I could show some of how this is put together under the hood and show some more details. So I'm happy to do that. Happy to help. 10,000 miles is doing great. No real issues to speak of. Planning on doing the Hot Rod Power Tour this year. Um, Everything we can start up at the top, and I've made the shaker functional. So this shaker base is just something that's homemade. Started out as a pizza pan of all things. You can see down here it is connected to these standoffs on the valve cover with wing nuts at 4 points. And I have a oil catch can welded to it as well as a mount for the dipstick. Same on the other side, another standoff, and the last one. So I have a flap on the back of the shaker to keep debris out. And we can just undo this as though it were factory, pop it off. You can see I've kept the water drain hose underneath of the shaker. Just have kind of a rectangular K&N filter and this D-shaped notch cut out in case a bunch of rainwater gets down. There's another drain welded to the back of this to let it out. This has worked fantastic. I was a bit worried about the amount of CFM that the turbo was capable of pulling through that filter, and worried that maybe the intake wouldn't be overall large enough. So in order to counter that, if we follow the intake pipe, I have what was a a boost actuated exhaust cut out here. There's the actuator. And so when we hit positive boost, this opens and leads to a secondary filter that's tucked into the fender. That way we can be sure that the turbo gets all the air it can possibly need. Follow this around, and then we're running through an intercooler. Exits the turbo here, goes into the fender, and loops around and comes out in front of the core support. And you can see running into an intercooler there that's tucked in nicely into the front bumper, and out the other side where we have a blow-off valve teed in, and finally up through an elbow into the intake. The intake is a Dorman LS6 intake. I do have a few concerns about maybe this eventually opening up and blowing apart, being that the top half is plastic welded to the bottom half. But I'm currently limited at 10 psi, 10,000 miles, and no issues yet. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. It's really a big science experiment. Okay, on the hot side, we have homemade exhaust manifolds made out of Schedule 40 cast steel pipe and elbows. Basically just log manifolds made to fit my application. This one goes forward and down using Corvette accessories because the alternator is in such a location and power steering pump that they allow a very nice outlet down here for the driver's side hot side to exit. That hot side comes up and does sort of this loop up into the turbo here. There is a wastegate tucked down here. It's kind of difficult to capture on camera, but I have dual wastegates. One for the passenger side, one for the driver's side. This is the wastegate for the passenger side. And this is the wastegate exit tube for the driver's side. And you can see it just follows around and wires back into this 4-inch main outlet that I have. Full exhaust. Turn down where the heat and air box used to be. Runs under the car. Runs through a Hooker Max Flow muffler, 4-inch all the way, where it splits at the rear axle into 2 3s, using these nice pots turn downs so that it still looks somewhat factory from the outside. The wastegates are tied to an air compressor that I have concealed in the trunk, which is controlled by the Holley Dominator ECU to maintain 10 psi at the intake manifold. Coils, just use the stock truck coils. 2001 5.3 round coils. Made my own bracket so that it looks a little bit less cluttered. Wideband O2 sensor for the Holley Dominator. I have, you can just see it peeking out back down there. I do actually have both heat and air conditioning on this car, but I've used vintage air so I could shave the firewall clean. The compressor is tucked down under the turbo in sort of the factory location. I believe it unfortunately may be impossible to get the actual compressor on video, but here are the hoses coming from it. Here's the service ports, low and high. I have a dual Windstar fan on the radiator, which pulls through the intercooler, the radiator, and the evaporator for the AC unit. Works very well. Actually, you would think this would not run very cool, but it runs between seemingly 160 and 190 under basically all circumstances. Part of that may be because I have an independent transmission cooler here with a fan grafted to it. I've opened up a hole in my core support, and I have a separate transmission fluid temperature sensor in the transmission pan, and when it hits a certain temperature, this fan will kick on, so that does take some of the cooling burden off of the radiator. And then on this side, I have an engine oil cooler, which is much the same. I have an engine oil temperature sensor in the oil line here, the blue and black wires there that you can barely see, and the computer controls that as well. But this one rarely ever kicks on. I was concerned that maybe the turbo would overheat the oil. It does not seem to. The fuel pressure regulator I have mounted here. I have dual intake pumps. It runs on one most of the time. When it gets into boost, it kicks on two. It's a 1/2-inch fuel line. They're both Walbro 255s. Seems to provide adequate fuel. And then here we have some of the catch can plumbing. I have a PVC valve, and then I have these one-way check valves. One of these is connected to the intake pot so that under boost, this is likely to have more vacuum than the engine itself. So I can keep pulling on the PCV valve there. Here's where it runs under the throttle body. I am using the LS6 Valley cover to help mitigate some of the oil burning issues that the 5.3s have. That's just about it for under the hood. I'm going to take a brief look inside. I've tucked everything up under the dash. The Holley Dominator is actually behind the glove box. It's quite a tight fit, but it does fit. I have speed hut gauges. These have been fantastic. The speedometer did die on me pretty early on after about 3,000 miles, but Speed Hut replaced it, no questions asked. Was very good to work with. I have tach, engine temperature, speed, fuel gauge, oil pressure, voltage, and then down here we have boost, air fuel ratio, fuel pressure, and then up here I have transmission temperature, transmission pressure. I am running a 204R, so I'll put these up here to make sure that I wasn't killing the transmission, which has also surprisingly held up quite well. The switch is electronic traction control. I have an input to this, to the Holley Dominator ECU, and when I switch this on, a wheel sensor that I have grafted to the front wheel compares the wheel speed of the front wheel to the rear wheel. And if too much rear wheel spin is observed, it will start by removing boost, followed by timing until the car regains traction and takes off. And this actually works very well. And the other LEDs here are cruise control, headlight, bright light, engine caution, and engine warning. And I do have functioning cruise control. I actually use the cruise module off of the 2001 Chevy truck, and it is tucked into this compartment along with a host of relays, tucked away nicely out of sight. Works well, reaches well, no issues there. It's engaged by pressing this button the same way as the factory cruise control would be, and everything works well. That's pretty much it. Doing fantastic. I appreciate you asking about it. Hopefully this helps someone.